What's up, guys? Nuance Bro checking in, and today we're going to be talking about Kanye West's visit to the White House and the comments he made about welfare and the black community. And here are the comments that he made.
You know, people expect that if you're black, you have to be Democrat. I've had conversations that basically said that welfare is the reason why a lot of black people end up being Democrat. They say, you know, first of all, it's a limit to amount of jobs. So the fathers lose the jobs and they say, we'll give you more money for having more kids in your home. And then we got rid of the mental health institutes in the 80s and the 90s, and the prison rates just shot up.
Now, these comments drew criticism from all over the media, but we're going to focus on three particular media reactions to these comments. So the first reaction comes from Roland Martin. Let's take a look.
First of all, if anybody understands history, African Americans were largely Republicans after the Emancipation Proclamation. And so you can look at the numbers. When you look at the African Americans who went into Congress, the U.S. House, as well as the U.S. Senate, they were black Republicans.
Roland is correct here when he says that a majority of blacks were Republican in the Reconstruction era. But none of that contradicts Kanye's claim about blacks voting Democrat due to welfare. Welfare didn't exist during the era of Reconstruction, so that point's kind of irrelevant, but let's go on.
And it didn't change really until Herbert Hoover came with the Lily White movement. Still had significant black support on the Republican side, but black folks were saying they were not strong enough when it came to civil rights. The shift really started with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Why? Because of New Deal programs, not welfare, New Deal programs that also greatly benefited white folks more than they did African Americans.
It's funny that Roland mentions Herbert Hoover as the turning point, because Herbert Hoover received a majority of black votes during his successful election, and even after the Great Depression, where most of the country turned against him, he still received a majority of black votes when he was running against FDR. FDR, in fact, actually got quite a minority of black votes. He only got a handful. Now, this did change under the New Deal programs, which were essentially the first sort of national welfare programs under FDR. But it wasn't just blacks. The entire country kind of swarmed up and decided to vote for FDR en masse, and they re-elected him 4 times. Well, I mean, they elected him 4 times, but, you know, re-elected 3 times, I guess you could say, but he was elected 4 times. And this was obviously due to coming out of the Great Depression and then also fighting the enemy during World War II.
Republicans still got a significant number of black support in 1952, 1956, even 1960.
I guess this depends on what you mean by significant, because after 1932, blacks never voted majority Republican ever again in a presidential election. So one could argue that after FDR instituted his increases in federal spending, expanding the scope of government, and basically creating the first sort of welfare programs, that blacks were really in favor of that and started voting less and less for Republicans and more for Democrats who supported these policies.
So Kanye West is dead wrong. He lied. Black folks did not turn Democrat because of welfare. In fact, the most dramatic shift took place in 1964, when it was Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona who declared his opposition to the 1964 Civil Rights Act. That is when it all changed. Not welfare, Kanye. It was the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So on that point, whoever told you that doesn't know what the hell they're talking about.
So here Roland talks about Barry Goldwater and LBJ, and he basically said blacks voted for LBJ because Barry Goldwater was opposed to the Civil Rights Act. But this is a little bit more complicated and it's not as clear. First of all, LBJ was kind of known as a notorious racist. Even Obama noted that in his first 20 years in Congress, he opposed every major civil rights legislation that ever came up. Conversely, Barry Goldwater was not a segregationist, nor was he any kind of racist. He was in fact a lifelong opponent of racial discrimination. At the beginning of his political career as a city councilman, he had led the fight to end segregation in the Phoenix public schools. His first staff assistant when he went to the Senate was a black woman. He was a member of the NAACP. Goldwater voted against the Civil Rights Act because he believed as a conservative that the federal government did not have the power to compel states to conform to its idea of racial equality, or to dictate to individuals whom they must associate with. Even the executive director of the NAACP, although he disagreed and did not support Senator Goldwater, said he does not believe Goldwater is a racist.
This is the basic disagreement between the Negro community and Senator Goldwater. They don't think he's prejudiced. They don't think he's a racist. I don't think he's a racist.
LBJ was elected for a myriad of reasons. He was the successor to John F. Kennedy after he was assassinated, and he kind of used that to his advantage. He signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 just 10 days before the Republican National Convention. And due to this, he actually gained a lot of Republican votes. Also, LBJ used the very effective tactic of playing on the fears of Americans of nuclear war. Just a few months before the election, the movie Dr. Strangelove came out and actually really stoked up fears about nuclear war in the United States. And a lot of people saw for the first time what a nuclear explosion looked like. And it led to LBJ running what is even today considered one of the most controversial political ads in history.
7, 6, 6, 8, 9,
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
These are the stakes to make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd.
But what he also did, which is what he's probably most known for after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, is his Great Society program and his war on poverty, which he campaigned on. These are the programs that led to the creation of the modern welfare state and modern welfare programs we know today as things like Medicaid, food stamps, and the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So for Roland Martin to say that Kanye is wrong about this is completely inaccurate. The two examples that he cited as the reason for why blacks voted less and less Republican and increasingly more Democrat just so happened to also be, FDR and LBJ, which resulted in the biggest expansion in federal spending and federal welfare programs that the country had ever seen. And what they created essentially what is the modern welfare state today. So the next example I want to cite is from Geoff Bennett. He's the NBC News White House correspondent. Kanye West's comments today about African Americans and welfare were as objectively false as they were dangerous in perpetuating stereotypes that position low-income blacks as the face of America's welfare system. And he goes on to talk about how these are divisive 1970s politics and all these things. So he states that Kanye West's comments were objectively false with regards to welfare and African Americans. So let's see his reasoning. Here are some facts to combat the figments of West's uninformed imagination. Government data show that welfare, an umbrella term which can include Medicaid, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, also known as food stamps, and temporary assistance for needy families, benefits other groups the most. Whites make up the largest share of those receiving food stamps, 36%, and Medicaid, 43%. Hispanics comprise the largest ethnic group to receive temporary assistance for needy families, 37%. So he cites a statistic that says that whites are a plurality of welfare recipients. Now, this is true, and it makes sense because whites are the vast majority of the population. Now, it depends if you include white Hispanics or non-Hispanic whites, but roughly the white population of the United States is around 70%. So roughly 70% of the United States is white, and from the statistics that he cited, roughly 36% of food stamp recipients are white, and about 42% of Medicaid recipients are white. So while they have the most numbers in those programs, and they are a plurality of those programs, they are still much less than their percent of the population. But notice how he doesn't cite any of the black statistics. According to Pew Research, 15% of whites have received food stamps in their lifetime versus 31% of blacks. That means blacks are more than twice as likely as whites to have received food stamps. Now that's just food stamps. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, on average in any given month, means tested benefits, also known as welfare benefits, 41.6% of blacks were more likely to participate in government assistance programs in an average month compared to only 13.2% of non-Hispanic whites. That means that the rate of black welfare recipients is more than 3 times higher than whites, but whites will be a larger number of total welfare recipients because there are way more whites in America than blacks by a factor of 6. So Geoff is either being purposefully misleading and intellectually dishonest, or is just completely ignorant of the facts. Now, the final critique comes from Yamiche Alcindor, who is a White House correspondent for PBS NewsHour. Let's take a look at what she has to say.
he talked about really stereotypes that have been used against African Americans throughout history. He said that at some point, African Americans like welfare, and the fact that there are not fathers in the homes of African Americans. These are things that are, again, stereotypes. They're not true.
Now, she says that these stereotypes are not true, but she doesn't offer any facts to back up that claim. She merely asserts it. But let's take a look at the two claims that she did make. She said that Kanye said that blacks like welfare, but that's not exactly what he said. He kind of said that blacks vote Democrat because of welfare. Now, we already addressed the welfare comments earlier in this video, so I won't repeat myself. But her second claim was that Kanye talked about black fathers and how they're missing from the home and things like that. And she said that's a stereotype that isn't true. Well, let's take a look at the numbers. According to the Centers of Disease Control, approximately 72% of black children are born out of wedlock. Now, to be fair, just because a child is born out of wedlock does not necessarily mean that that child is growing up without a father being present in the home. Some couples have children before they're married. Some couples never get married, but they cohabitate and live together and all that good stuff. So let's take a look at more numbers. According to info compiled by the US Census Bureau and analyzed by the nonprofit Kids Count, approximately 67% of black children live in single-parent households where only one biological parent is present. Note that this number does not include children who live with other family members instead, or live in institutions, so the percentage is at least 67% when it comes to black children who grew up in a household without their biological father present. Now, at the same time, this does not necessarily mean that these children have no contact with their biological father or parents. It just means that he's not present in the home, but it's often the case that they don't really have that father or that parent raising them the same way they would be if they were present in the home, and usually they sometimes have no contact at all. So as you can see, given the info that we already presented, Yamiche Alcindor doesn't really have a rational basis for opposing the comments that Kanye made. So as you can see, Kanye's comments, although eccentric, were actually correct. So Kanye's comments were based in history and fact, while the critics decided to ignore the problem in favor of coddling and perpetuating victim narratives, instead of agreeing on the extent of the problem in the black community, where we could actually come to a consensus about what the issue is so that we could solve those problems moving forward. Anyways, guys, that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you would like to support this channel, please consider becoming a supporter on Patreon. And not only will you help support more videos like this, but you will gain access to exclusive video clips, our members-only Discord, as well as other perks. So please go to www.patreon.com/nuancebro to become a patron today. Also, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bro.